Hello, I'm Pamela Davitt, Vice President of Business Development with Data-Guard365. I've been in IT since the turn of the century and in cybersecurity the last 5 years, at a time where cybercrime has had an increasingly negative effect on businesses. I'm passionate about sparing companies the loss associated with cyber attacks, which can often mean loss of their life's work and their reputation. Data-Guard365 is part of a 30-year legacy built upon expertise within information technology, HIPAA-Guard compliance and regulation, documentation, and cybersecurity. We provide penetration-hardened cybersecurity that allows you to focus on your business by using the latest cutting-edge technology and experts. You know that your information assets will never be seized, compromised, ransomed, and that your operations will not be interrupted when you have us as your data security partner. Whether you are the CEO, CFO, CIO, COO, we know that your company is relying on you to make good choices about heightened security and that you're doing that to the best of your time and resources available. My job is to educate the management teams in our marketplace who haven't yet engaged a cybersecurity partner, and to make sure they understand that doing that is probably their #1 priority in the current workplace environment. And as much as you look to us for advice and direction in this cybersecurity space, we're bringing you experts to share their knowledge and insights as to how you and your company might address your current need for heightened data security. Today's a red letter day. I'm excited to be interviewing Richard Mays at Epic Brokers Insurance nationwide. Epic works globally to broker insurance policies that most sufficiently cover the risks and potential loss to the companies that they serve. Richard is a bright mind on this topic of cybersecurity insurance, and I'm sure you'll come away from today's podcast much more knowledgeable on this subject. Let's welcome Richard May as our guest today on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Richard is in charge of national cyber practice for Epic Brokers nationwide, and he is a wealth of knowledge, and we're excited to have his answers to questions that our clients are asking and that we know are really relevant at this point in time. So with no further ado, we'll just go right to those questions, Richard, and we thank you very much for being willing to take your time with us today.
Again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You bet. Tell us, how are policies changing in your industry?
So right now, there's an awful lot of claims activity around ransomware. So ransomware is really driving an awful lot of the underwriting processes for all of the insurers. That means that they're really starting to dig in to a much deeper level on the security maturity of the potential clients that they're working with. And as a broker, we're working with our clients through those processes to try and present them in the best way to the insurers. So some of those things, for example, can include making sure that the ransomware supplements they're asking for, that when you answer those answers properly reflect the depth of the security processes you've got in place.
Excellent. We're curious to hear too how you define data and information assets.
So insurers look at a couple of different big ticket items when they're going through their rating process. One of the fundamental drivers, and this might seem a little odd to those outside the insurance industry, is actually revenue. So that's one of the primary drivers. But past there, they'll normally ask you how much personal information, personal health information, credit card data, or biometric data you're storing. And they use that, the number of records, as a second gauge for their rating process. The third gauge, which is really goes down into the fine detail of the security processes, things like whether or not you've got multi-factor authentication on all of your accounts, whether you're doing that just for admins, if you're using separate admin IDs. Those kinds of questions are also driving the underwriting process. much more than they did even 6 months ago. What that means in the real world is that an organization that, for example, isn't using multi-factor authentication, many insurers will decline out of hand.
Interesting. It's not so strange when you talk about how it affects revenue stream, because we know with a cyber attack, you can be down for weeks, sometimes months, and that with encryption codes, if you pay a ransom, you don't necessarily recover all your data. So that makes sense that you're looking at that. You mentioned the number of records and looking at that as a parameter. Tell us about the differentiation of health records versus other personal information.
Right. So health,
Yeah.
so health records are usually more valuable to the criminals because they contain a lot of background information. It's fairly common for them to have information about who your parents were, for example. And that means that the bad guys can use that information on a much longer term basis to try and get either loans or other financial record type information or credit cards using your information than just from a social security number and from a name. Coupled with that, of course, health records have special protections under HIPAA as well. And if you lose healthcare records, which are covered by HIPAA, the Office of Consumer Rights, OCR, would normally launch an investigation, and they do fine people if they decide that the security didn't meet the necessary reasonableness standards.
Interesting. You should mention the healthcare and the weightiness of those records. Data-Guard was born out of HIPAA-Guard, a company that the enterprise owned and developed for rural hospitals. And in the course of finding out that HIPAA was hard to document and the compliances were complicated, we were able to bring cybersecurity to that sector and then realize that was something we should leverage for all industries.
Yeah.
So we realized that healthcare is very important, but tell us about communications, if you would, for a second. Where does that fall in? We know that some of our clients have asked about that. So what does insurance expect of protection of communications, or is that a separate matter?
It's not separate. So cyber policies respond to a loss of information regardless of the media. So that's one of the things that we probably need to make clear. So if you lose paper records, a cyber policy would respond to that. Similarly, if you've got confidential information that's being transferred via an email, if that information is intercepted by a criminal, by a bad guy, that's also covered by a cyber policy. So business email compromise is one of the largest causes of loss. Probably until quite recently, it was one of the drivers until ransomware essentially took over. So insurers are quite used to that. So when we look at the information they ask for, they do make a lot of focus around how your email is set up. So are you using web-based email? And if you are using web-based email, do you have two-factor authentication? They'll ask you some more technical questions. And by the way, I'm not a technologist, but they'll ask you some more technical questions about whether or not you're using the SPF framework, or I think it's DKIM, and some of those other elements, whether you've got sandboxing employed for detonating malicious attachments. It's very important to the process because, of course, email is often the route in for the ransomware still.
Okay, so there are levels of loss, hardware and network breach. What is the impact of a cybersecurity partner or a do-it-yourself approach?
Well, the real issue is, do you have the expertise, right? So the simple fact is that in the current environment, there are relatively few organizations that actually have the resources to employ top-rate security experts. So for many organizations, whether they've got an internal IT team or if they're using a managed service provider, extending the team to an external managed security services provider in my opinion, is often essential.
Well, and they can leverage the costs that we incur as a cybersecurity partner so that it makes it affordable for them to have top-notch cybersecurity, like you say, without having to expend ridiculous amounts of money.
Correct. I mean, the simple fact is, I do a lot of work with very large organizations. And one of the things that's quite clear is that CISOs are in great demand. So it's not uncommon for me to be dealing with a new CISO every year. And it's not because these guys were bad, it's because they're going to new opportunities. And the same is true down the entire security chain. They're massively in demand.
Yeah, truly. Do you pay claims more readily? This is a curious question we really would like an answer to. Do you pay claims more readily and for larger amounts when the insured has a cybersecurity partner or not?
That doesn't really play into the adjustment of the claim. It can be easier for the claim to be adjusted if the technology was deployed correctly in the first place, right? So, for example, that you've got good logs going on to record events, which means that when the forensics come in to try and figure out what went on, it's easier for them to do that, and it helps resolve the issues faster. But in terms of the ultimate resolution of the claim, not specifically. The policies respond to the liability or the first-party costs that were involved in that process, and that's largely independent of the technology or the technology provider. But again, there are some elements which are important around the time frame based on the quality of the technology that was deployed, including things, for example, like the quality of the SIM, the logging, the 24/7 SOC. Those things can make an impact, but it's not going to actually change the process from the insurer's point of view.
Okay, good to know. Something that we're providing our customers right now, because it's a hot button, is a statement they can put on their website that speaks to the fact that they will not compromise their constituents' data. And we know that this is called risk, if you Google it, risk supplier, supplier risk management. There we go. And this is promising that you won't jeopardize the people with whom you do business's data, and that they're in their good right to ask you to document that you've heightened your security, your cybersecurity, so that they don't become compromised. How do you look at that from an insurance standpoint? Are you insisting on those?
Yeah, so from an insurance point of view, supply chain risk is covered within a cyber policy. So insurers do want to know what you're doing to actually identify, track, understand the cybersecurity exposure from your downstream and upstream suppliers. There's now an industry around doing that, which has got nothing to do with insurance, with a number of different security scoring companies like BitSight, Security Scorecard, Science. There's probably at least another half dozen, all of whom are aimed at trying to allow you to understand the security maturity of the organizations you're doing business with. And insurers do actually tap into that, right? For obvious reasons, that information helps them in their underwriting process. The only thing I would say about that is that in our experience, there's a distressing number of false positives that come up from those scans. So we do spend a fair amount of time when insurers have run those scans, going back to our clients to understand which of the identified issues are actually real or not, as the case may be.
Interesting. And this is why, with a cybersecurity partner, Data-Guard has artificial intelligence, which is behavioral detection, the dynamic behavioral detection versus the static antivirus, former way we used to thwart cyber attack, right? And with artificial intelligence, that tracking and documenting that you're looking for as an insurer is easier to find. You'll find those false positives quickly, readily, and you'll also see what's really going on, the breaches that are mitigated. Is that something that you appreciate from the time standpoint needed to use to, or
right, just to be clear, I'm a broker, not an insurer, so I'm acting as the intermediary for the buyer of the insurance. That's why I spend the time going back to them, working with them to try and present them in the best possible light. The real thing that either an MSP or an MSSP, depending on the specifics, should be providing there is ensuring that those false positives, and remember these are external scans, right? So it's not touching the internal network. They're finding things like exposed RDP, or the fact that stuff hasn't been patched, or there are ports that are open in the firewalls. And one would hope that an MSSP has done all of that for their client, and they don't suffer from those.
I see. And we are often the extended arm of an MSP.
Yeah.
Because you're completely familiar, managed service providers do all the technical work of keeping a network running and doing the patches and the things they should, the things that they're certified to do, whereas an MSSP is the security services piece with the artificial intelligence and the, as you were referring to earlier, trained cyber career specialists that know how to do that. So we work very closely with many MSPs, or in some bigger companies with their IT team.
Yeah.
Be able to have that documentation in place so that were something to happen and you have a claim presented to you, you have that documentation. So we also understand that whenever a claim is submitted, there has to be some forensics, and that you work with companies like ours and your client, the insured. Can you just say a little bit about that and what that?
Absolutely. So not quite the question you asked, but I'm going to point out one of the biggest problems that arises when a client has an incident, and that is that they start responding to the incident without telling their insurer. And all of these policies require that you tell the insurer, and that the insurer approves the vendors that are bought on site. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and stop the bleeding, so to speak, right? So if the particular event, it's appropriate to shut the servers down, then you shut the servers down. The real issue is that they then go the next step and they will start to wipe the servers and recover. And that's a problem, because you start to lose the information that's necessary for the forensic part of the process. The insurers have got 24/7 coverage for incidents. Most policies on the declaration page, that's where the limit, the policy period, the named insured, they normally also have a notice section for claims. And on almost all cyber policies, there's an email address and or a 1-800 number, and they will normally respond to you within an hour. And the very first thing that happens in that is that you get a lawyer involved. And the reason you get a lawyer involved is because if you've had any form of incident, you need to try and get privilege, so that if it becomes litigation in the future, the investigation itself doesn't become subject to subpoena, so that you've protected those documents potentially from discovery.
Okay, so we know that it's best to be prepared, and preventive measures are always the way to go, and that's what your insurance policy is, correct?
Yeah.
And we work in that same vein, because we believe and we understand that you require disaster recovery and incident response as part of the documentation for anyone you insure.
Yes.
But ideally, no one wants to recover a disaster. Ideally, no one wants to recover a disaster. And so your payouts are less and claims are fewer and all of that if we can, as we do, mitigate breach altogether. But we all need to be prepared.
Yeah.
And this is a good point you bring out, that phone call needs made, that
yes.
You should call your insurer first, and then work, and we would work in tandem with whomever our customer calls.
Right. So as we're on the subject, and while it goes through my mind, one of the other issues that we find is, of course, we're all used to storing documents electronically, including our insurance policies. And if your drives have just been encrypted, you can't get to your insurance policy. So so of all of your policies, the one that you need, this is the irony, right? So of all of your insurance policies, the one you need in paper, somewhere sensible, is your cyber policy.
And that should be in your disaster recovery notebook or your incident response notebook, shouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Part of your policies and procedures. Okay.
Yes.
Good to know. Oh, you've got so much insight. We really appreciate these answers. We needed it from an expert, and we're getting just that. Tell us about the federal OFAC list as it's expanding. Do you find that they're enforcing those regulations more strictly now about not paying cyber criminals?
So OFAC have always required that you not pay any entity or individual on the OFAC list, and if you do, you're subject to some pretty hefty fines or penalties. The way that the process has always worked is that the breach coach, so the law firm, and the forensics team work in conjunction to figure out whether or not the specific attacker is one of the entities or individuals on the OFAC list. If they aren't, then all of these policies provide for the insured to make a decision to pay the ransom. And if they do that, then the insurer will reimburse them for the ransom payment. In most instances, it is what we call indemnification. So in almost all instances, you actually have to pay the ransom first, and then the insurer will pay you back. But insurers cannot do that if the entity is on the OFAC list. So even if you make a decision that you're going to essentially breach OFAC, at that point, it's your own money. And you also run the risk of being in serious trouble with the US Treasury.
Good to know. Again, back to, wouldn't it be nice if we can prevent breach?
Yes.
Just keeps coming back to that, doesn't it? I am looking at some live questions that are coming in, and I think I want to go ahead and ask you these from viewers that are interested. They want to know, what is the advantage of using a broker like Epic? So
really it boils down to expertise. And maybe I need to take a step back and just describe more appropriately why I'm calling myself a broker. There are really two forms of intermediary in the US that act between a buyer and the seller of insurance. And one's called an agent. And the agent actually represents the insurance company. They're not representing the risk purchaser or the insured, if you will, on those policies. That's right. So whereas I'm representing the buyer of insurance, I do not represent the insurer. Also, commonly, agents only have access to one or a couple of insurers. I deal with dozens. So I have the ability and the expertise to go and shop across multiple insurers, including going into, for example, the London market, Lloyd's. For larger risks, I use the Bermuda marketplaces. So we access insurers essentially on a global basis to get the necessary risk transfer for our clients. And we provide a level of expertise around this. Just to give you an example, I've now been doing cyber essentially since it appeared in the early 2000s as a truly viable product. But I've been doing insurance. It grew out of E&O, errors and omissions insurance. I've been doing that for the best part of 40 years.
Very good. So you really have the options available to your insured. They're getting the best coverage for the best prices and all risk covered. That's
yeah.
Great.
So cyber policies are not standard, right? No. Many policies that you're familiar with are auto policies, general liability policies. The policy forms themselves are basically, most of them are issued by an organization called ISO, not the International Standards Organization, it's the Insurance Services Office. And most insurers use those same forms. That is absolutely not true on cyber. So the forms are very different. They use different words. They group the risks in different ways on those forms. So unless you actually understand what's going on, it can be very difficult to understand those policies.
When we spoke before, you and I, before this podcast, you were mentioning about when we talked about what was the single most important thing that an insured could do, and that we as their cybersecurity partner could do for and with them. And you mentioned the insurance document and the questions that are asked on that. Do you want to elaborate on that a second? Because that was really useful.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, insurers are really digging into the cybersecurity maturity of the organizations they're insuring. And they do that really using two documents. One is the application for insurance. Those documents are relatively static. They don't change very often. And part of the reason for that is that they're actually filed with the state insurance commissioners, and it's a process to change them. But all of them are now also using what they're generally being referred to as ransomware supplements. And those ransomware supplements are changing based on what's happening in the real world. So you can combine those two documents and look at the questions that they're asking on those two documents. And it really gives you a roadmap for the kinds of security to have to prevent a ransomware attack or a cybersecurity attack in general. So you can consider them as a checklist, right? So they usually have very obvious right answers and very obvious wrong answers. So you can run through those documents, and they're normally written. I'm not a technologist, but most of them I can read the question and understand what's being asked. I might not know what SPF is or DKIM, but I know that based on the application form, I should have it.
Good to know. The co-founders of Data-Guard are of that same mind, and we do some of that. And we will continue to keep an eye on the most current forms you use for that very reason, because we too think that is the best roadmap we can advise our customers to make sure that they're following and that we are supporting them in doing that. And what we provide is, as we understand it today, currently what you require. So we need to just keep abreast of that document and make sure that any new questions that come out there we're aware of, and we'll do just that. Another question that was coming from the audience here is, what are my advantages seen through your eyes as the insurance provider to locking arms with a qualified cybersecurity partner?
In many ways, it mirrors working with a broker, right? It's expertise. It's expertise that you can't afford to have in many instances within an organization because of the demand for security expertise. So working with an MSSP gives you access to that higher level expertise, which one hopes would reflect in the real world in a lower overall risk for you having some form of incident, some form of breach. And just as an aside, as I'm using those words, if you do have something happen, it's an incident. It's not a breach. It's not a breach until an attorney tells you to call it a breach.
We'll remember that. They're the ones that determine the what should we say?
Right. The reason is if you start
vocabulary.
if you start calling it a breach, arguably you've triggered the breach notice laws. Right. Okay. So it's an incident.
Very good. Good to know. Richard, this has been very useful, I am sure, to everyone that's watching. I know I've learned a lot today. Appreciate your time. I think we're going to do a second one of these and a little deeper dive even, and we will keep everyone apprised of when we do that. But we thank you for your time today, and my computer is acting up. So thank you so much for today, and all the best, and we will be in touch soon.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. If anyone has any specific questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to spend some time, whether that's email or on the phone. Okay, we will put your number up so that they can reach you by email or phone. Thanks. You bet. Thank you, Richard. You're welcome. Thank you everyone for watching. Bye-bye.